So last week I was talking to a friend I hadn't seen in some time at a party. She didn't know I had this YouTube channel or TikTok or whatever talking about books at the time, but she mentioned how she was trying to get back into reading fiction. So I mentioned this channel and I said there would be some good book recommendations on there, but I also thought, hey, I should just do a video about how to get into reading fiction if you haven't really done it or if you haven't done it in a while. I did a smaller video on my TikTok about some accessible book recommendations, but I think here I'm going to talk about tools that you can use to get back into reading fiction, and then I'll intersperse the book recommendations. I'll be recommending some poetry, some short stories, as well as some really accessible novels that I think will get you into reading fiction. Not only just fiction, but more literary, in depth fiction. You could start reading some things that are very surface level, not particularly deep, but I think there are really entertaining stories that have a lot of depth to them that will be much more rewarding to you and really get you the joys of reading something that someone has created and something that you can revisit and come back to. So, yeah, I think I'm going to start with talking about some strategies about what I use as someone who reads over 100 books for the last decade or so. And especially in this modern world, it is particularly difficult. And then I'll talk about some book recommendations throughout. Also, if you like this sort of content, I guess I should say like and subscribe. I hate saying that, but I did promise myself I would do a video of the top 10 fiction and top 5 nonfiction reads that I did last year if I got to 1,000 subscribers, and I think I'm less than 200 away, so hopefully I can do that soon because I'm running out of other video ideas to do, and it'd be really nice to do that before, I don't know, 2024 is over. But let's get into my top strategies for making the time and the concentration and the energy to read fiction, particularly in this modern world where we are so full of distractions. I mentioned a lot of these issues in my video about why particularly men don't read fiction, but we are all of us in this world, which is an attention economy. We have our phones, we have everything distracting us from sitting around with a page that doesn't move. We all work stressful jobs, we don't have the time. So here's what I found that works for me, and hopefully it can work for you, and you can find the joy in books that you might have had or you might just newly discover. To really get into reading fiction, I think Ray Bradbury actually said it best, where he said, each night you should try to read one essay, one poem, and one short story. It's really not that much time. It can be as little as 15 minutes to a half hour. And even poems can usually be read in much less than 1 minute. And just getting into that habit of sitting with a longer text, there are some longer essays and short stories which might get you into that concentrated mood. Those are really good ways to sort of train yourself into sitting in the quiet without the distractive buzz of technology. Because in the end, it is all about rewiring your brain. Your brain has been rewired by your cell phone, by YouTube, by this technology which is constantly chattering at you. And it's helpful to take a step back and take something that is rewarding in a different way and get your brain used to that, because it won't come right off the bat. And I think starting with shorter pieces is the best way to go. As for reading essays, I want to give a shout out to The Baffler, which is a really solid sort of lefty magazine which has some really interesting essays as well as poems and short fiction, so you can get everything contained within there. The New Yorker can be a bit sort of elitist, but occasionally it has some really good pieces. And actually, I think you could just pick up a newspaper. I'm sure your local newspaper would be really, really grateful for the support. It can be just a little bit per month, and you get something either delivered to your door or in an email subscription where you can just read these short things where you get used to text again. These are really, really great ideas. As for poetry, I would say that I'm one of the first to admit that I don't have a huge extensive knowledge of poetry and analysis, but I do know what I like, and I do know that I like literature. And so we'll get into more poetry recommendations later in the video, but I would say just start out with a really accessible poet like William Carlos Williams, who's one of my favorites, and he actually is sort of in opposition to T.S. Eliot and that more obscurantist version of poetry, which uses a lot of Latin and is really doing this linguistic cartwheels and all of these jumps and acrobatics. Williams was very much in this school of very clear and interesting and easily accessible poetry, which is nonetheless extraordinarily powerful. So if you want to get into reading something that has a lot of power but is still very easy to understand, at least the words are, go for William Carlos Williams, and we'll get into more poetry recommendations later on. So say you've started reading, but you continually just keep looking at your phone or keep being distracted by this thing that you're really used to doing. I found if you are lucky enough to have a sort of larger apartment or house, put it in another room and force yourself to sit there without it. And honestly, it will take some time. You'll be a bit fidgety, but you'll get used to sitting without that screen with you. Or if you don't have a really large place, power your phone down, make it more inconvenient to access it. And I promise you, slowly you can retrain your brain to sit without the distraction of scrolling, of YouTube, of TikTok, to get used to sitting with words on a page again. I find myself having to do this occasionally because, just like everyone, we are in an attention economy and we are just really addicted to these screens. And honestly, it can be just really helpful to force yourself off. I did start reading some ebooks on my phone, but again, I found I would just click out and scroll. So if you don't have books or you want to read something that's a bit easier to transport, get an ebook reader like a Kobo. They're really easy and accessible, and you really have to log on to use the internet. So that's a really great way to read with a screen, and maybe a bit of more of a transition from your phone to getting a full book. But I honestly believe actual physical books are the best way because they are sitting with a physical object and they'll really help you rewire your brain. If you find yourself struggling with motivation and you're like, I just can't really keep myself on reading, please join a book club. We are increasingly isolated these days, and joining a book club can just be a great way to make new friends, but it's also a great way to apply that peer pressure to yourself. If you have friends that do read, it's a great way to do that. But honestly, if you don't have any friends that read, go to a local bookstore, and I promise you, almost all of them have a book club. I have a horror book club here in Toronto that is part of a local bookstore, Little Ghosts. Please check them out. They're a completely horror bookstore. I love them. But they've got two different book clubs. I'm in one of them. I'm also in a book club with friends, and that keeps me reading, and it keeps that pressure of me to read things that are a bit outside of what I would normally read, and just keeps interests varied, and it gets that pressure on you to read books more often, because reading is an isolating activity, but reading and discussing books should absolutely not be. Always talk about books with friends, encourage people to read. You can start your own book club, get friends to start reading with you, share these strategies, and I promise you it will be very, very rewarding. Now, if you tell me you don't have the time or the energy to read, I would say you've watched this much of the video, you do have time to spend 10-15 minutes a day reading. But if you find your brain is really exhausted from your job, honestly, just take a little break and keep working on these exercises to rewire your brain. I sort of feel lucky because I use a different part of my brain, it feels, when I'm reading fiction than when I'm using it at my job. But please just take some time. You do have time to scroll through YouTube and do this passive thing. Reading can be just as passive, and it can be more fun and accessible, especially with these book recommendations, which I will get into shortly. But you do have time to read if you have time to watch this video, if you have time to scroll. All it takes is a bit of training and a bit of self-discipline. Put your phone away, and yeah, let's get into reading some of these really great books that I'm about to recommend. So for poetry, I already recommended William Carlos Williams. Just pick up any of his collected works. Really, really accessible poetry. But as a teaser for the best books that I read in 2024, if enough people subscribe, the poetry book that I had in that is a Toronto book called The Seventh Town of Ghosts by a local poet, Faith Arkerful. And they're these really interesting poems about basically family and police violence, because she's a black writer in Toronto, but also discovering love and discovering life again. So it really is the first poetry book I've read which almost has a novelistic character arcs, going from really dark depths of depression to grappling with your understanding of society and then falling in love with love and life and family again. It's a really beautiful collection. Arkerful writes these really beautiful poems which are really easily accessible even to audiences that aren't used to poetry. It's a really beautiful collection, and I encourage everyone to pick it up. It's really, really good. Also, from previous videos, which I've done from previous years of the top books, I would also recommend Richard Sickens' Crush, which is this really great exploration of gay sexuality in this almost movie action poetry, which is just very visual and almost violent and risky and just energetic. I really love that collection, and it feels very accessible. As well, Layli Long Soldier's Whereas, which is a great exploration of Indigenous issues through poetry, including found poetry, using treaties to really explore language and the history of violence towards Indigenous peoples. Really, really great collection. All of these you can just jump into. I think they're really easy to read, even if you're not used to poetry, and they're these really beautiful, rewarding, accessible collections that don't have really complicated language or structure, but are nonetheless just really profound poems. Okay, so you've sort of dipped your toes into fiction and interesting creative works with poetry, and you want to get into some longer short fiction works. Well, anyone who's watched my previous videos know one of my favorite collections from recent years is The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, which is this beautiful collection of these really wonderful humanistic stories exploring Black women and love. There is pain in there, but there's wonderful, realistic, really relatable stories, even if you aren't Black like me, about just daily life and the joys and sorrows and love of life on Earth. Really beautiful collection. It's just incredible work. There's also What to Do When a Man Falls from the Sky, which is a really wonderful collection of Nigerian short stories. They're all centered around the same sort of theme about women in Nigeria, but each of them is so beautifully written and so beautifully told that by the end it feels like you've almost read an entire novel just because of the depth of the issues explored, and as the author circles all of these things and tells them really, really beautifully. I just love this collection. I think more people should read it, so I'm really plugging it now. I also want to plug a really varied collection, which is called How to Pronounce a Knife. It's a Canadian collection, and it centers Laotian immigrants and the immigrant experience in Canada. It has a really one of my favorite short stories of all time called Slingshot, but because it just explores all these different perspectives and each story feels utterly unique and interesting, all of them are just really great and show the variety that an author can really do. And just one of my favorite collections, really beautiful and accessible, and really puts you into someone else's perspective in really great short bursts. And I really think shows the absolute power of fiction if you're into something that's slightly more challenging but is still accessible in its form and its content because it's short fiction. The final short story collection that I'm convinced can get you into reading is anything by Edwidge Danticat, particularly The Dew Breaker. Danticat is a Haitian American writer, and she writes these short stories that are actually interconnected, so the characters will overlap between the stories, and then at the end you sort of realize how it's all happening. So The Dew Breaker definitely does that, and by the end, when you've read each short story, it feels like you've read a whole novel. It is almost sort of like training wheels for reading a whole novel, but it's also just really rewarding as short fiction, and I think just a really great complete work. Her book collection Crick Crack is also very good, but hopefully with all of these you can get yourself to read some longer works that are sort of interesting but don't have the full commitment of a novel. And we will get into 4 novelistic recommendations which are relatively short, very easy to read, which are entertaining but have a lot of depth. Let's talk about those next. You really can't talk about accessible, really wonderful, literary, entertaining fiction novels without talking about Kurt Vonnegut. I remember Breakfast of Champions just being really entertaining, and then Slaughterhouse-Five blowing my mind, Cat's Cradle. But here I want to talk about one of his books which isn't sci-fi. It's God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, which is this achingly humanistic portrait of a guy. He inherits some money and he goes off to try to do some good with it. And of course, that's insane. Why would you do anything with money other than spend it on yourself? So his family tries to get him committed to a lunatic asylum. It's this really wonderful thing that really shows off Vonnegut's strengths, where you have a protagonist who is just trying to do good, and these wonderful sketches of people, these sympathetic portraits of all of humanity. It's a wonderful socialist book, and I just love it to bits. I think it's one of Vonnegut's best works, and it's just going to make you feel so much empathy and love for the world. Another deceptively simple and deeply philosophical writer is one of my favorite Canadian authors, Andre Alexis. So his breakout book was 15 Dogs, which won the Giller Prize, one of the top fiction prizes here in Canada. And it follows 15 dogs which are granted human-level intelligence by the gods, and they're set off to wander in Toronto to discover the meaning of life. And so Alexis really uses these entertaining and comedic and really accessible stories to explore these really deep philosophical issues, and it's an incredible book. Everyone I've talked to absolutely loves it, and is just really accessible, entertaining, but also just has so much humanity to it. Even despite you're talking about dogs, you will just have a new appreciation for life and death and everything in between. Let's say literary fiction might be a bit too much for you and you're more used to genre works. Well, I would highly recommend Becky Chambers' The Wayfarers series, which is science fiction, but is just this really wonderful exploration of characters. So a lot of sci-fi is exploring a concept and really taking that idea and running with it. But the Wayfarers series is just as much about the people on board this ship, which is going on a mission, and explores each of their own individual stories. And I think is, again, this entryway into that more in-depth literary fiction fiction, which is more character focused. There's still a lot of plot, there's fun, there's sci-fi, it's really well written, but it's a really great entry into a really entertaining but really in-depth series, which I think will be really rewarding for you, even if you go in thinking it's going to be relatively shallow. There's a lot of depth in sci-fi. It's one of my favorite genres, probably my favorite genre, and definitely pick this up if you just want something that's entertaining, but it will be thinking about it for years afterwards. Of course, you can't talk about genre and just really accessible, entertaining, but deep prose work if you don't talk about the noir genre and Raymond Chandler. He's the king of detective noir. He created so many detective tropes. He's famous for The Big Sleep, and Humphrey Bogart played his protagonist in a movie. But I'm not going to talk about The Big Sleep. I'm going to talk about Chandler's most personal novel, which is The Long Goodbye. It's sort of a longer book, it's over 300 pages, but it really explores a lot of societal issues through the detective noir genre. So there's a fun, twisty detective story, but within there, there's exploration of love and abuse and alcoholism, which Chandler himself struggled with. So I really think you should check out this. It's a really great exploration of deeper issues, again, wrapped in an entertaining package. So I guess there you have it. That's 12, I think, books, including the William Carlos Williams, that will try to get you into reading books a bit more, that are accessible but entertaining, but really in-depth things, as well as some strategies to get into reading fiction. So if you are looking for other books, I've got a whole backlog of videos here. I have a book blog, which you can follow. You can follow me on Instagram, on TikTok. And yeah, let's just keep reading books, because I really love this art form. I find stories so fascinating and interesting, and I always like to stray a bit off the beaten path. So as before, please subscribe, because hopefully if I get to 1,000, I can do my 2024 best books video. I might just do it anyway, but hey, every little bit helps. And I'll talk to you soon about the joy of books, and I wish you all of the best on reading more. Talk to your friends about books, join a book club, make books popular, and make really interesting books popular. They don't all have to be these more shallow books. They can be these really in-depth, entertaining books that you'll just think about for the rest of your life, including, I think, hopefully all of these books that I've recommended for you here today. Until then, I will talk to you soon about even more books, and yeah.